Moving to the new house was the opportunity Clara and I had been waiting for. After years of struggling to stabilize ourselves financially, we had finally taken a step toward what seemed like a peaceful life. The house was located in Oakfield, a small town known for its tree-lined streets and tranquil atmosphere. It wasn't anything grand, just a simple 1950s construction, but it was ours. From the moment I saw the house, I felt something difficult to explain. It wasn't necessarily bad, but it was a sense that there was more to it than the bricks and faded paint revealed. Clara, on the other hand, seemed enchanted. "It's perfect," she said, walking down the main hallway with enthusiasm. The realtor, a bald man named Mr. Roberts, mentioned that the house had been vacant for some time. "The previous owners moved out in a hurry," he said, without elaborating further. The first day was a whirlwind. We unloaded boxes, arranged furniture, and began shaping what we would call home. By nightfall, exhausted, we collapsed onto the couch and opened a bottle of wine. The silence was almost absolute. Too much so. Even in a small town like Oakfield, I expected to hear some distant sound of cars or voices, but there was nothing, only the creaking of trees in the wind. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. There was a sweet metallic smell in the air, like old blood mixed with flowers. I went to the window, thinking it might be coming from outside, but the scent seemed to be inside the bedroom. Clara didn't notice it, or maybe she was too tired to care. I lay down beside her, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling that we were being watched was almost tangible, as if the house had eyes. The next morning, Clara woke up excited, ready to start the small renovations we had planned. While she painted the living room, I went to the basement, which I hadn't explored yet. The stairs creaked with every step, and the smell of mold was strong but bearable. The space was practically empty, except for an old dresser in the corner. That same afternoon, Clara called me to the kitchen. "Did you hear that?" she asked, looking frightened. I shook my head, but before I could ask what she meant, the sound came again, a faint dragging noise, like someone moving something heavy upstairs. We went to check together, but nothing was out of place. "It must be the wind," I suggested, though I knew it didn't make sense. That night, while Clara slept, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I froze, holding my breath. The steps stopped at the bedroom door, and silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of expectation, as if something was waiting for me to act. The following days brought more oddities. Objects shifted positions. Clara began having constant nightmares, and that sweet smell appeared and vanished without warning. One evening, while Clara was at the store, I decided to investigate the house more thoroughly. I started in the basement, armed with a flashlight. As I approached the dresser, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, scratch marks on the floor, as if it had been dragged. With considerable effort, I moved the furniture and discovered a small hidden door in the wall. The door was made of old wood and looked ready to fall apart. When I opened it, I was hit by a blast of cold air. Inside was a narrow space, little more than a tunnel, leading into the house's structure. Something told me not to enter, but a morbid curiosity pushed me forward. The tunnel was damp, and the smell was almost unbearable. At the end, I found something that made my heart stop, a circle of extinguished candles with strange symbols drawn on the ground. In the center was a small straw doll with a piece of fabric tied around its neck. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there, or at least no one I could see. Clara began to change. At first it was small things. She forgot where she placed objects and seemed distracted during conversations. But soon I noticed she avoided certain parts of the house, especially the basement. When I asked why, she simply said, "I feel like we're not welcome." One night I woke to find Clara sitting up in bed, staring intently at the wall. I called her name, but she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with an expression that wasn't hers. There was something empty in her eyes, something that made me pull back. "They're here," she whispered. Clara's whispers that night echoed in my mind the next day. The mention of they made me question what she had seen or felt. Something in the house was affecting her mind, and I needed to act. I decided to investigate the basement again, this time with more caution and without Clara around. Armed with a stronger flashlight and an iron bar, I wasn't sure against what. I returned to the tunnel I had discovered. The smell was even stronger than before, a pungent stench of rot mixed with something chemical. At the end, I noticed the circle of candles was no longer empty. Now, there were small, charred bones, like those of a bird arranged around the straw doll. I nearly ran out, but something caught my eye, a small niche in the wall behind the makeshift altar. With trembling hands, I removed the loose bricks. Inside, I found an old notebook wrapped in a red-stained cloth. The pages were covered with symbols and notes in shaky handwriting. I managed to decipher enough to understand that it wasn't just a macabre curiosity. It was a record of rituals performed in the house, apparently by a former resident. The journal mentioned opening passages and offering energy to those who wait. One phrase, highlighted in red ink, sent chills through me. The house feeds on bonds. It devours slowly until nothing is left. I was never the type to believe in ghosts. I always thought haunted house stories were just exaggerations, something to scare kids or serve as themes for cheap horror movies. But all that changed when my wife Mariana and I bought our first house. It was an old mansion in the small town of Millhaven, isolated enough to ensure the peace we were looking for, but close enough to the center to not feel completely cut off from the world. The house had a rustic charm, exposed wooden beams, tall windows, and a garden that looked like it was straight out of a 1950s landscaping magazine. The price was surprisingly low for the size of the property, and although the realtor mentioned structural issues as the reason for the discount, nothing seemed too serious at first glance. In the first few days, everything seemed perfect. We spent hours decorating the rooms and exploring every corner of the house. It was on the third day that we found something peculiar. In the basement, there was a locked door. It was a heavy metal door with a rusty padlock. When we asked the realtor about it, he just shrugged and said it was probably an old storage room. That same night, however, I heard a strange sound coming from the basement. It was a soft noise, like someone scratching the inside of the locked door. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe rats or some other animal had settled there. Even so, when I went down to the basement to check, the silence was absolute. The locked door remained still, but something was different. There were scratch marks on the outside, as if something had tried to get out. The next day, Mariana mentioned something strange. "Did you leave the guest room door open?" she asked. I said no. The night before, we were sure all the doors were closed. It was no big deal, I thought, but something in her tone made me uneasy. Things got stranger when we started noticing objects moving around. A lamp that always stayed in the living room was found in the upstairs hallway. A kitchen chair was in the middle of the living room, though neither of us had moved it. And then there was the mirror. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed a stain on the bathroom mirror. As I got closer, I saw it wasn't just a stain, but a mark, like a wet hand had pressed against the glass. Mariana was asleep in bed. There was no way she had left that there. After a week, things started to get worse. While cleaning the hallway, Mariana called my attention to something etched on the wall. In small, nearly faded letters, someone had written a name, Anna. "Do you think it belonged to a former resident?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Mariana didn't respond. She looked disturbed, and I didn't blame her. Each day, the house felt heavier, as though something invisible was watching our every move. That night, I heard the sound in the basement again. It was louder this time and sounded like moaning, as if someone was wailing behind the door. I grabbed a flashlight and went down, determined to open that damn room. But the padlock was still firm, and the tools I had weren't enough to break it. When I came back upstairs, Mariana was sitting on the bed, pale. "I saw a woman," she said. "She was in the hallway. She looked at me for a second and then disappeared." The next day, I decided to investigate the house's history. At the town archives, I discovered that the property had gone through several owners over the decades, but one particular event caught my attention. Almost 20 years earlier, a woman named Ana Resende had been murdered in the house. According to the records, she was attacked by a violent ex-partner. The man was never caught, and Ana was found dead in the basement. That explained the locked door and perhaps the manifestations. When I told Mariana, she was horrified. "We need to leave," she said. I agreed. That night, while we were sleeping, something woke me up. An intense cold filled the room, and I felt like someone was standing beside the bed. I opened my eyes and saw a female figure in the corner of the room. She had no eyes, just dark holes where her eyes should have been. Mariana woke up too and screamed, but before I could do anything, the figure disappeared. That was enough for both of us to decide to leave the house the next day. As we tried to pack our things, the basement door opened on its own. I knew I had to go down there and end this once and for all. With a hammer in hand, I descended the stairs, while Mariana begged me to come back. When I reached the once-locked room, the door was now open. Inside, there was a wooden chair with rusty chains attached to the arms. On the floor, a blood-stained scarf still looked fresh. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around and saw Ana. She stood there, pale and silent. Her expression wasn't threatening, but it was full of sorrow. I froze in place, unable to move or speak. It was as though she wanted me to understand her pain, to know her story. We sold the house shortly after that night and never went back. The new owners didn't ask questions, and we didn't offer any explanations. Life slowly returned to normal, but the memories of that house linger. Even now, when I'm alone, I sometimes think of that figure in the basement. Perhaps she only wanted to be remembered, to have her story told. Or maybe she just didn't want to be forgotten in the darkness of that house, behind a locked door. When we found that house in Milford, it felt like we had won the lottery. Luciana and I had spent months searching for something spacious enough to start our family, but still within a budget that wouldn't bury us in debt. The house was on a quiet street, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to guard the property like silent sentinels. The realtor was up front about the property's history. "It's an old house," he said, "built in the 1950s. The family that lived here before kept it in good shape, but, well, people say it's a bit peculiar." He didn't elaborate on what that meant, and frankly, I didn't want to ask. Old houses have stories. That's to be expected. On the first day, everything seemed perfect. The wooden floors creaked, but they had a unique charm. The backyard was spacious, with enough room for a garden and maybe even a small vegetable patch. While unloading boxes, Luciana looked happier than I'd seen her in months. "This is going to be amazing," she said, smiling, and I believed her. That night, after setting up the essentials, we had pizza on the living room floor, lit by a single lamp. Everything seemed normal until we heard the first sound. It was a low noise, like someone dragging something heavy upstairs. Luciana froze, her wide eyes fixed on mine. "What was that?" she whispered. I stood slowly, grabbed a flashlight, and went up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. The next morning, the incident from the previous night felt almost laughable. "It must have been the house settling," I suggested. Luciana agreed, but I noticed she avoided going upstairs alone. While she organized the kitchen, I went down to the basement. I needed to check the electrical panel and the heater. The basement was a mix of stone walls and raw cement, with a strong smell of mildew. There were boxes left behind by the previous owners, but none of them seemed important. When I came back upstairs, I noticed something strange. Luciana was standing in the living room, staring at the hallway leading to the guest bedroom. "Did you move the wardrobe?" she asked. I walked over and saw that the large wooden wardrobe, which had been against the wall, was now in the middle of the room. I hadn't moved it. And Luciana, as small as she was, couldn't have pushed that piece of furniture on her own. Maybe it shifted during the move, I improvised, trying to hide my unease. Maybe it wasn't as stable as it seemed. On the third night, the noise came back, but this time it wasn't just a sound. There were footsteps, clear and distinct, echoing from upstairs, going back and forth as if someone was pacing back and forth. Luciana squeezed my hand under the blanket, and I knew I had no choice. I had to check. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in the closet and climbed the stairs. Nothing. Each room was empty, but the footsteps continued, now coming from downstairs. When I returned to the living room, Luciana was crying. "I saw someone," she said, her voice trembling, "a shadow at the end of the hallway." I didn't know what to say. The next day, we decided to start renovations. We thought that maybe if we kept ourselves busy with something productive, we could push away the discomfort we were feeling. We decided to paint the guest room first. While we were scraping off the old paint from the walls, something appeared under the peeling layers. Marks. It was hard to say exactly what they were, but they looked like scratches, long and deep, as if someone had dragged their nails across the plaster. "This isn't normal," Luciana murmured, and I knew she was right. The following weeks were a mix of desperate attempts to ignore the events and moments of pure panic. The lights flickered at night, the noises kept going, and now even our neighbors seemed strangely distant. One day, an older lady, who lived 2 houses down, called out to me while I was heading out to buy groceries. "You bought the Harris house," she said in a somber tone. Before I could respond, she added, "I hope you're stronger than the last ones." When I asked her what she meant, she just shook her head and went back into her house, and it was Luciana who found it. While looking for something that could explain the problems with the heating system, she stumbled upon a hidden trapdoor under one of the shelves in the basement. Inside, there was a small wooden box. When we opened it, we found old photos. They were of the Harris family, the previous owners, but there was something strange about them. The photos showed parties, family gatherings, but in all of them, one figure in the background seemed out of place. A woman with dark hair, always standing silently. Luciana recognized her immediately. "It's her, the shadow I saw in the hallway." On the last night, the tension reached its breaking point. I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. Luciana was sitting on the bed, pale, pointing to the door of the room. In the hallway, the shadow was there, clearer than ever. "Please stop," Luciana screamed, but the figure just disappeared. The next day, we left the house. We didn't say goodbye to the neighbors or worry about taking all our things. We just left and never came back. I still think about that house from time to time. I don't know what really happened there or who the woman in the photos was, but one thing is certain: some stories don't need to be explained to be terrifying.